All right, so now we're on to divisions of the nervous system. And we have the central nervous system, and that consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Obviously, the brain is our controlling area. It is very, very complex. Lots of nervous neurons in there, lots of nervous system components. It's going to control our thinking, our movement. We do have two hemispheres we'll talk about. There is a Diencephalon, a brainstem, a cerebellum. But the brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord, and both the brain and the spinal cord connect to what we call the peripheral nervous system, and we'll talk about that. We do have coverings over these, and they are called meninges, and these are membranes that protect the brain and the spinal cord. We'll take a look at these, and they lay between the bone and the tissues in the skull. So the meninges, again, 3 layers. Outer layer, dura mater. This is tough and dense. There are some sinuses in their spaces, and there is a space we call the epidural space. We'll take a look at that. Below that is the arachnoid matter, or sometimes people call the arachnoid layer. And there's a subarachnoid space that contains spinal fluid. And then you have the pia mater, and that is our inner layer, and that is attached directly to the surface of the brain or the spinal cord. And it does have the blood vessels, and that's going to nourish the central nervous system itself. This holds true for both the brain and the spinal cord. So when you look at the models of the brain and the models of the spinal cord, that's going to be the same. All right. Okay, so when we look at these meninges, this is a better look at it. You can see that pia mater directly touching that spinal cord, and then we have the arachnoid mater, and then we have the dura mater, and then we have spaces in between. Okay. All right, spinal fluid, it is produced in the 4 ventricles. Spinal fluid itself should be clear, colorless, just like water if you work with it. There are 4 ventricles, 2 lateral ones, and the 3rd ventricle and the 4th ventricle. The 2 lateral ones are called the 1st and the 2nd, and then you have the 3rd ventricle and then the 4th ventricle. There is a cerebral aqueduct that connects the 3rd and the 4th. So if you look at it, you can see there, and there's your aqueduct, and going on down. This is a side view of it. And I show this in the model that you guys have in the brain model. You can see it. So the brain, you can see all the functions of the brain, but it's basically your sensory, your perceptions, your motor commands. So the information is being fed. We talked about this from your sensory receptors up to the brain, processed here, or processed in the spinal cord, and then out to the skeletal muscles if something needs to be done. So your higher mental functions, your memory, your reasoning, your personality, everything is here in the brain. So you have these main 4 portions of the adult brain: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brain stem. And looking at the picture, the sagittal section, you can see that cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the brain stem. Okay, so looking at the cerebrum, this is the largest part of the brain. You have 2 hemispheres. You have a connection called the corpus callosum that I pointed out to you guys in the video on the actual parts of the brain. You have ridges and grooves. The brain curl looks like, quote unquote, the brain, but you basically have a mountain range. You have peaks and valleys. All right, peaks and valleys, and your valleys, your grooves are a sulcus, plural sulci, and the ridges are a gyrus or a gyri. Then you have these fissures. You do have some that are pretty noted One is the longitudinal one that separates the cerebral hemispheres, and the transverse one that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So you can see these lobes, you can see this central sulcus here, you can see this gyrus here, but you can see that central sulcus, okay? And this divides into these lobes. And if you notice, for some reason these match the names of the muscles and they match the names of the bones. So the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe. So we're pretty consistent in terms of the skull and staying consistent with it's the name of the brain and the name of the bone overlies it and the name of the muscle overlies that. Okay, so that should be good. So your longitudinal fissure is going to divide your left from your right halves, and you'll be able to look at that. So those are the 5 lobes: the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, occipital. The insula is deep within this lateral sulcus, but again, they're named for the bones that they underlie. When we look at the cortex, this is a little interesting, a little different with the brain. You have a thin layer of gray matter. We talked about gray matter before. That's going to make up the outermost portion of that cerebrum. And then underlying that is white matter. When you get to the spinal cord, it's the exact opposite. The gray matter is inside and the white matter is outer. So just remember that. All right. So when we get to the white matter, we said that contained myelinated axons. And again, just remember it's opposite when we get to the spinal cord. So the cerebral cortex, higher mental functions, everything you think about in a higher function like reasoning, retrieving information, storing memory, that kind of thing, interpreting impulses. This is our intelligence. This is our personality. We do divide them into basically sensory, motor, and association areas. We'll talk about what an association area is, but each area contains these neurons that work together to perform a particular function. All right, so you can look at some of these, and you can see they're pretty much placed. I'm not going to make you memorize these, but we'll talk about some of these, but they are in particular areas. Like this, this is the auditory area. It's near the ear, the occipital lobe for visual, that sort of thing. So the sensory areas of the cortex, some specific ones is Wernicke's area. This is the speech area. This is the temporal lobe and parietal lobe, usually in the left hemisphere, and allows us to understand and formulate language. The visual areas, obviously, and we talked about this a second ago, is in the occipital lobe. This allows us to interpret what we're seeing. The auditory area, that's the temporal lobe, that is interpreting hearing. And then you have the sensory areas for taste and smell, for your other senses. Okay, and you can look at this homologous. All right, and association areas they're not primarily motor or sensory. They connect to each other, but basically what it allows us to do is analyze and interpret what we're sensing. So it allows us to see this stuff or hear this stuff and interpret what it is. So you have this association, you see something, and the association area allows you to tell you what it is. I see a dog. Okay, I recognize that as a dog. And that's what we basically have to do. So we do have association areas that are associated with certain things, like the parietal lobe with understanding speech, or the temporal lobe, with visual scenes and music. So each one of these lobes has a particular association area that helps us with analyzing and combining these sensory information and interpreting what's going on. All right, so the motor areas of the cortex, we do have a primary motor area. This is in the frontal lobes. This controls our voluntary muscles. And most of these fibers cross over in the brain stem, which means whatever you're doing on the right side, it's the left side of the brain that's controlling it. okay, and vice versa. We have Broca's area, which is usually in the left hemisphere, that it controls the muscles that we need for speech. And we have an eye area that is above Broca that controls the eyes and the eyelids, and you can take a look at that. So memory, interesting, we do have short-term memory and long-term memory. The short-term memory is really the working memory. Some of us have shorter short-term memory than others. But basically, it's something we do very short-term, and basically that you have that information, the memory, you learn it for a short period of time, and unless you repeat it and repeat it, it doesn't go into long-term memory storage. Okay, your long-term memory holds more memory than short-term, and it lasts a long time. It lasts your lifetime. The structures that you have to make new synaptic connections, and basically you have the increase of the neurotransmitters and the effectiveness of those with repeated stimulation. So again, you read something like in this course, and okay, I read it, but I don't know it that well. I don't remember it that well. But then I go back and I read it again, and then I take my worksheet out and I study that, and then I'm studying for my final exam. Repeated times and repeated times, you might start to begin to get some of this into long-term memory. Usually what puts it into long-term memory is some emotions associated with it or something like that. Okay, the diencephalon, this is between the cerebral hemispheres above the brain stem, basically under that corpus callosum, under that what we call that fornix. It surrounds that third ventricle. You can see these portions. You have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, what we call the optic chiasma, and the pineal gland. So the thalamus and the hypothalamus, you're going to get to know the hypothalamus really well next semester. But the thalamus is the gateway for the sensory impulses. Okay, so all the sensory impulses come up to the thalamus, and it's receiving these impulses, except for smell, and it channels these to the appropriate area of the cerebral cortex for interpretation. So it's kind of like the gateway. You come up and you get distributed wherever you need to go. The hypothalamus becomes very important. We talk a lot of times about the pituitary gland. Sometimes people call the pituitary gland the master gland. But the hypothalamus is the regulatory gland for the pituitary gland. So it's anything the pituitary gland does in terms of hormones. It has regulatory hormones that are secreted that either increase or decrease whatever the pituitary is doing. So again, you're going to look at that when you get to AP2. The limbic system, there are several structures in there, but this is emotional responses, that emotional impact, your feelings, your behavior, wanting to survive, reacting to life-threatening situations. Okay. All right, so down to the brain stem. Midbrain, pons varolii, and the medulla oblongata. This connects the brain to the spinal cord itself, and you've got these nerve tracts and this gray matter. All right, so let's look at the midbrain. This is a fairly short section, and it lies between, as we said, this is the top. I know I showed you the actual brain. It's, again, it's kind of like, looks like the head of a bird to me. But it has these bundles of fiber that connect the lower part of the brainstem and the spinal cord with the higher part of the brain itself. There is a cerebral aqueduct that lays there that connects the third and fourth ventricles. And the main motor pathway is the cerebral peduncles. One of the things that you'll hear about is the red nucleus, and that has reflexes that help you keep yourself in position. All right, so the pons, this is the bulge, kind of looks like the belly of the bird again for me. It is a nerve impulse relay between the medulla and the cerebrum, and it helps us regulate some of the rhythm of the breathing. Now the medulla, you're going to talk a lot about this in AP2. This is just a continuation of the spinal cord. It does conduct the ascending and descending impulses between the brain and the spinal cord, and it is a cardiac respiratory control center. So when you get to AP2, you'll really be looking at what the medulla oblongata does. It does contain various non-vital reflexes and controlling of that, coughing, sneezing, and you can read it. And the problem with the medulla oblongata, because it contains these control centers for the cardiac area and the respiratory area, if this is injured, this is often fatal. Then we have the RAS, the reticular activating system. Basically, this is it says complex network of nerve fibers scattered throughout the brain stem, and this is what allows that cerebral cortex to be aroused into wakefulness. And so if you have a decreased activity of the RAS, you're gonna sleep. Okay. All right. So you can see, obviously, this aqueduct. You can see this midbrain and the pons and the medulla. And this is a real good look at this diencephalon area. Oops, sorry. I'm going to go back. So you can see those. All right, this is cerebellum. The cortex is gray matter. You can see that kind of tree pattern, which is called arborvitae. That is white matter. This is going to coordinate skeletal muscle activity, so it helps us maintain posture. And again, right here. Okay, there is that arborvitae. Looks like to me a tree trunk. All right, so going into the spinal cord, this is a column of nervous tissue that is continuous with the brain, extends down through the vertebral canal at vertebral foramen, begins at the foramen magnum, and goes all the way down to L1, L2, terminates right there at that space. And you have spinal nerves coming out through that vertebral foramen, and they are grouped according to the level of the vertebrae, so that you have cervical, you have thoracic, you have lumbar, etc. All right. If you look at the spinal cord, this is a cross section that we're going to take a look at, and this is kind of the model, the picture that you have. And you have two main functions of that reflex, and basically you have a reflex arc. The main thing with the spinal cord is to be able to do things quickly. You know, if you put your finger into a flame, you don't want to sit there and put it into the flame and go, okay, move that finger now, and you move it. No, it's got to be very quick but very fast. So a reflex, what we consider a reflex, is a subconscious response when you have a stimuli. And this allows for certain things like moving the finger. It maintains homeostasis, maintains our heart rate. We start running, we get scared, heart rate goes up. You know, you swallow, you cough. You swallow something wrong, it gets damn wrong, you start coughing. So these are reflexes that you have to stay alive. What you call a reflex arc is this pathway that is consisting of a receptor and then your neurons and then the effector. So you have this sensory input right up to the spinal cord and then right out to go and do something. All right. So receptor, central nervous system, down to the effector. And this makes it very quick and very easy. Again, if you get hurt with something, if you get you touch something that hurts, you can very quickly move a particular finger or limb away without having to go up to the brain to be processed. Okay. So you can see the receptor here in the skin coming in. There's your sensory neuron coming in. You have the interneuron connecting up, and there is that impulse going out, that motor neuron that says move. Okay, so when you have reflexes, you have a monosynaptic or stretch reflex, very quick, very fast, 2 neurons, sensory motor, and you have only one synapse. And this is the kind of thing like, you know, knee jerk, you tap on that knee, and yeah, you're going to kick something. It does help us maintain upright posture. We are able to keep from tipping over, you know, and falling down. You have a withdrawal reflex that I talked about when you touch something or step on something painful or something like that. This prevents tissue damage because you're moving very quickly away from that stimuli. That is a polysynaptic situation. And you have what's called reciprocal innervation. The flexors contract, the extensors are inhibited, and you're going to move quickly. So you can take a look at that. All right. So peripheral nervous system, these are nerves that connect to the central nervous system and other body parts. You have basically a couple of subdivisions of this, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system are the cranial and spinal nerves that connect to the skin and the skeletal muscles. These are conscious activities. Okay, somatic meaning whole body, if you will. Autonomic nervous system, these connect to the viscera. These are unconscious type activities. So your stomach digesting, that sort of thing, where you don't even have to think about it whatsoever. And we'll look at these. Okay, so the cranial nerves, you have 12 pairs. Some are sensory, associated with senses. Some are primarily motor. Most are attached to the brain stem, except for the first pair that start in the nasal cavity, as we mentioned. The important thing is that the cranial nerves are numbered with Roman numerals. I know a lot of students have not learned their Roman numerals, and they have to be in Roman numerals. So when you talk about a cranial nerve, it's CN and then the Roman numeral. Okay, and they're numbered 1 through 12, from the anterior to the posterior, superior to inferior. And I don't require that you know all these, but you can see these numbers. But these are the Roman numerals, and if you put Arabic numbers on the test, it's going to be marked wrong. All right, so we're going to go through these very quickly. Olfactory, the way I remember, there's several mnemonics to remember the cranial nerves. What you need to do is remember the mnemonic. The one I remember on old Olympus's towering tops, a Finn and a German vended some hops. So it gives you the first letters. There are other mnemonics, but that's my particular one. So the cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory, obviously sense of smell. The optic nerve, number 2, again, these are sensory, sense of vision. Ocular motor nerve, number 3, motor nerve. Okay, you're talking about being able, these muscles that raise the eyelid, move the eyes. So that name pretty much says it all by itself. The trochlear nerve, which is number 4, this is a motor impulses to one pair of muscles that move the eyes. Trigeminal, most people are pretty familiar with this in terms of, you get TMJ, you're irritating some of that nerve. That is cranial nerve number 5. There are 3 branches to that, one going to the eyes, one going to the upper teeth and the palate and the skins of the face, and then one down into the jaw. So this is primarily the impulses of the muscles to allow us to chew, but you can take a look at where they're going. The abducens, which is 6, or used to be called the accessory. This is a motor nerve. It's the impulses to one pair of muscles that move the eyes. The facial nerve, this is facial expression. This is cranial nerve 7. Facial expressions, the tear glands, salivary glands, that sort of thing. Vestibulocochlear nerve 8. You're going to learn about this when we get to the ear, but this can be called the acoustic nerve or the auditory nerve. This is sensory, and basically we're getting what we call, the reason why it's split. The vestibular branch of it is the equilibrium receptors of the ear, whereas the cochlear branch is the sensory from the hearing receptors. Because when we get to the ear, we'll look at this. Glossal pharyngeal nerve, tongue, pharynx. So we're talking about the pharynx part of the tongue, the tonsils. This is to the salivary glands and the muscles of the pharynx that allow you to swallow. So that's number 9. Number 10, the vagus nerve, called the wanderer. You're going to hear about that all through when we start talking in AP2 about the digestive system. This is and part of the cardiac area. So this is somatic impulses to the muscles of the pharynx and larynx that allow us to swallow and talk. And then we have the autonomic pieces that go to the heart and the other viscera, so that it allows them to work. All right, accessory nerve 11. This is a motor nerve, and you can see these branches. And again, these are impulses of muscles into the pharynx and the larynx and the neck muscles and that sort of thing. And then hypoglossal, under the tongue, 12. And this allows us to speak and chew and swallow. So again, cranial nerve number and the name of it. All right, so off to the autonomic nervous system. This is without any conscious effort at all. Controls all the activities in the viscera, your major organs. So smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, all the glands, allows us to respond to stress, anything like that. We'll get into that in a second. So what happens is there's 2 divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic, fight or flight. Parasympathetic, rest and digest. So the sympathetic division, it's preparing you, it's very active, any kind of emergency situation, what you have to do to either fight or flee. So it's glucose control, it's heart rate, it's breathing, it's getting the muscles ready to move. Parasympathetic, this is where most of the stuff is under rest. It's non-stressful. You've had your turkey dinner. You're going to rest and you're going to digest. Okay? So, that's it. All right? So, on to the next chapter.